So when we think about the term big, I'm going to say that word. What do you think of in this room? Shout out some terms. Data, Microsoft. Business, oil, media. So there's a phrase that I want you to take away from here today that is from one of my favorite authors, Alvin Toffler, who wrote the book Future Shock, 1971. I actually have asked my school district back in Seattle to make sure all the high school students read this book, which is interesting because it's almost like a history book based on what Toffler predicted. Learn, unlearn, and relearn. What we're going to look into today is that big is a disadvantage in the 21st century. We're seeing this all around us. How many people practice yoga here? All right. So I've been practicing it for 15 years. My wife got me into it when we were living here in Brooklyn. My favorite pose is the sun salutation when you open yourself up to the world. What it allows you to do from that position is move anywhere. Now, if we think about muscle building to get big, it doesn't allow us to be agile. And communication now is so fast, wherever we are in the world, that agility actually gives us an advantage. And this is why we want to move into lean thinking.
It's 12 hours.
Thank you. Because what lean thinking actually allows us to do is it allows us to be more agile. It allows us to make decisions. It allows us to test things and create feedback loops. So one of the things that I can hopefully bring to you today in the NGO or NFP space from the technology sector is how do you create fast feedback loops? You hear lots of terms coming out of Silicon Valley. Some of them are true. A lot of them are myths. Fail fast, move fast and break things. One of the things we really want to take away from that is feedback loops are important and we can use them anywhere, especially with the fact we don't need a lot of expensive technology anymore. In fact, I think the better way to approach things is how do people behave? Don't think of the technology. Think of how people behave and how we can communicate with them. In fact, I would go as far as saying that most technology now, if you think about it, centers on what sort of one area? Communications. It's almost all based on communications. We have a tendency of forgetting that, though, because we look at a number of things in spreadsheets and data points, and we forget that this is communicating in the 21st century. So the dilemma we have right now, I think in the space that we're involved in, is that we have many people who are we're trying to basically create communication systems that manage up. And this is why I'm always sort of the rebel at Microsoft, because I always tell people, don't worry about your manager. Don't worry about accountability up. Don't worry about the shareholder. Worry about what's below you. People, customers, those who actually live in the world, use services. Those are the ones that are actually going to make you drive what the future is. That's why, again, you have to learn, unlearn, and relearn how we think in this new era. The biggest companies, the most successful organizations are the ones that actually listen to those they're accountable to, not up top, but below them, those out in the field. And we learned this a lot in technology based on feedback loops that we create. It's interesting because if you look at the old era, it was people who basically would have a hierarchy, a big title, and they would say, make it so. I know better and I know best. The better way to approach things now is, hey, this is actually what people are stating to us. And we know this through actions, and we know this from talking to them. Some of the best communication isn't necessarily through building an app. It's actually from going and actually asking people, how do you feel about this? Or observing them without asking them those questions. There's a crazy thing, I'll actually get a little political here. I predicted the election based on social data before any of the media did by going to Ohio, Michigan, and Pennsylvania and looking at how many people had signs in their yard. And social data, what people were saying. Very easy to get caught up in filter loops and filter bubbles and think that what you're doing is actually, making an impact. It's much better to actually go and observe people. We're getting back to that psychological, behavioral state, even though we're surrounded by a lot of technology. So the solution, lean data. We don't want to think big, we want to think small. How do we move quicker with some information that we have? If we have $1,000 and we give it to someone, do we ask what they do with it, or do we look at the impact? One of the interesting things now is with universal basic income. Instead of asking people what they're doing with it, they're actually just observing what they're doing with it. And the results are actually very interesting, because what they thought people would just sort of sit around, hang out, not do much at all, people are creating entirely new ways of living now. So again, behavior based on observing. This is the lean data that we can have and how we actually make an impact in the world. A lot of words here, but mobile phones and feedback loops. So there's a variety of apps that we could either build or tap into that are third party. And almost everybody has a phone now. I think what's interesting is Apple just released the iPhone 10, which is $1,000. I actually like doing a lot of work on an old flip phone because that actually is what a majority of the people use in the world. And you get an idea of actually how they communicate, and you can communicate similar to them. How do they use SMS? What are they using in terms of their calling plan? And it allows you to set up systems that are either automated or may have another person on the other end of the line that ask just a few questions to get an idea of how people might be responding to the initiatives that you're trying to drive. So again, not only do you want to think of lean data as in what are the small nuggets that can create an impact, but also you want to think in a disruptive manner of you don't need the most expensive technology. You need things that basically will allow you to actually move quicker, and a lot of that comes with using actually the least expensive systems imaginable that are available to all of us in terms of how we put those together as systems thinkers. So how it works? Well, we have an impact question that we're going to ask. And in the technology space, it's always like on features. Hey, would you use this feature? And then someone basically would come back and say yes or no. And then you would basically go and figure out how you would scope to build that. And then you would go build that. And in terms of execution, you would learn from what they would do with that, and then you would take further action. This is all applicable now to our field that you're in because of intersectional learning. Again, in the old era, I have two daughters. They would basically say to me, Dad, I want to be an engineer, a doctor, a veterinarian, a volunteer, a teacher. You can be all that now because of the ability to learn things very quickly. There's a tendency of a lot of us not to borrow from other sectors. So one of the things that I really liked about coming here today is I want us to borrow from the technology sector in terms of how we initiate communications. Because these feedback loops have existed for a while in the SaaS, or software as a service model, and we can all use those in the NGO space. So one of the other things, how many people are familiar with this device? I'm sure most of you. What did Steve Jobs always do? Jeff Bezos actually does this now, but what does Steve Jobs always do before they created a product at Apple? All right, he asked two questions. One was an alpha and one was a beta. So these are the things that I want everyone to think about whenever they are using lean data to their advantage. The alpha on the iPod was the question of, do people want to take their music with them? Well, he knew the answer was yes, because the Sony Walkman had come before it. What he didn't know, or what was the beta, is would people pay for that music? And ultimately, that's what they were testing when they created that device. So with everything that we do in the NGO space in terms of lean data, there should be an alpha and a beta, a question that you already know, and then a question that you want to answer. And most of this actually could be things on communication in terms of if we set up an automated system that calls people, will they actually hit one or two if we ask them a couple of questions? Some NGOs have actually used this and found out that people actually like that because they don't want to speak to another person, but they want to give that feedback. Others realize people just hang up because it's basically like a robocall. But those are some of the betas that we need to ask ourselves. That way you get a better idea of how do we want to communicate with people moving forward in terms of the questions that or the mysteries that we're trying to solve for. So this is a little bit hard for me to read. There's a couple of alphas on the far left here in terms of companies that had sort of small stoves that they were creating. And they wanted to know, do people actually, will they use this stove if it burns less coal? The answer was yes. People wanted those. They were affordable. They fit into their homes. The beta was, how do they actually want to get information from us? Do they want to be called? Should we actually go and give them a survey? So there are a number of things that you may have to try in terms of your communication to figure out, how do people actually want to communicate with us? Because we have a tendency many times of thinking, well, everyone's going to want to get a survey, or everyone will go to our website, or everyone will take a phone call from us. And we don't necessarily know how people are going to react when it comes to communication. We might not get the best sort of population in terms of the feedback loops that we're trying to create. So again, questions to ask yourself. If you have an alpha, what's the beta in terms of the communication that you're trying to learn, so that you can then roll that back into your initiatives and have an understanding of the impact you're making in the field, because that's ultimately who you answer to. Again, that might be difficult to go back and talk to your manager about, but you could say that Jeff from Microsoft said it was okay. So let's remember the terminology build when we're thinking about the power of lean data. First, being bottom up. Think about the people that you're affecting in the field. Just like technology thinks about, or I should say tech companies think about their users, which almost every company thinks about nowadays. We hear the term a lot, customer centricity, or customer first, or customer obsession. How are we obsessing about the people who we are actually trying to make their lives better? They're the ones that we respond to first. Then we think about how we communicate that to the higher ups. Useful. What data can we yield that is sufficient to support our decision making? If we're talking to a certain amount of people who really aren't affected by what we're doing, that's not a good feedback loop. We want people who are actually affected the most by our initiatives, and talking to them quite a bit, because context changes. What they may say in January could be different in March, especially depending on where they live in the world. And we see that quite a bit now everywhere. The third is iterative. It allows for learning, adaptation, and replication. Ultimately, what we want to get into is an algorithm. But we don't want to settle on that algorithm and become too comfortable, because there's always new mysteries to solve. Again, that's why I brought up yoga. How can you flow with what's around you in terms of being iterative? It's not about being sort of mass or big anymore. And then light touch, using low-cost tools and technologies that require a minimal investment of time and money. Again, thinking about what people use. If they use their mobile phone, what are the things that they use most of? Do they like email? Do they open a lot of apps? Do they take phone calls? Those are the types of research that I think almost every organization is still trying to figure out, depending on who their test population is. And then finally, dynamic, the ability to collect rapid data in a fast-changing environment, which is what Lean actually allows us to do. And if you think about it in the software as a service space, you're constantly trying to figure out where to iterate, because we're trying to basically make the products better for customers, people who use them. It's the same initiative all around the world, no matter what we're doing now. How do we move quickly to make sure that we're enabling people and they're getting what is necessary? And that, of course, is always going to change the data that comes back to us. So again, my name is Geoffrey Colon. I'm author of the book Disruptive Marketing, and I work at Microsoft. Thanks again.